When I think back to that evening, the air itself felt rehearsed, as if life had scripted every detail to lull me into believing this would be one of those sparkling, unforgettable nights etched into family history. My parents' house was buzzing with laughter, plates clinking, and the faint perfume of cinnamon from my aunt's apple pie floating over the long wooden table that had seen decades of family gatherings. Every chair was occupied, every corner filled with chatter, and for once I almost believed we were a portrait of harmony, a family without fractures. I had my boyfriend's hand resting on mine, warm and steady, and I could sense from the way his eyes darted nervously toward his jacket pocket that something more than holiday cheer was hidden in his plans. I didn't need anyone to tell me. There was a vibration of anticipation around him, the kind a person cannot disguise when carrying a secret that feels too large to keep to themselves. He had been fidgeting all day, checking his watch, smoothing the lapel of his blazer as though it had betrayed him with some invisible crease, and avoiding wine refills as if clarity was vital for what he had prepared. I had known him for years, and his rituals gave him away. When he was anxious, his fingers tapped against glassware. When he was hiding something, his eyes skimmed past mine with exaggerated casualness. That night, every signal was flashing, and when he excused himself to step outside with my brother under the pretense of checking the grill, I caught the glimpse of a small velvet box shifting against the fabric of his jacket. The outline was unmistakable, square with rounded edges, the kind every girl knows by heart from jewelry advertisements and whispered dreams. For a moment, I let the warmth of that discovery sink in. He was going to propose. All those late-night conversations where he skirted around commitment, the vague promises of someday soon, the careful planning of our vacations together, they were culminating in this, in front of everyone. My family would watch me cross the threshold from girlfriend to fiancé, and he had chosen the setting carefully, under the roof where I had grown up, surrounded by relatives whose approval he always sought. It felt at first like something cinematic, almost too neat in its orchestration, like a scene lifted from a romance film. But even then, some undercurrent gnawed at me. His smile was too fixed, his laughter forced at the wrong beats, his gaze darting as though measuring the audience for the performance he was about to deliver. Still, I played along, smiling, clutching my glass, nodding to my cousin's endless stories about school and work, all while part of me rehearsed how I would react when he knelt down. Would I cry? Would I be speechless? Would I simply whisper yes with trembling lips? It felt like the sort of answer one only gives once, and I knew he expected something grand, the kind of acceptance that could drown out any of the doubts we had sidestepped over the past months. Because yes, there had been cracks, small ones, but persistent. His absences explained by long hours at work, his phone tilted away during late-night messages, the vague excuses about last-minute errands that didn't add up. I had convinced myself not to spiral into suspicion. Tonight, I told myself, was proof that none of it mattered. He was choosing me. Dinner moved in waves of conversation, the room swelling with noise and then settling into quieter pockets of dialogue. My uncles debated politics in one corner, my nieces clinked glasses of soda with exaggerated cheers, and my grandmother leaned toward me with a knowing smile that seemed to say, "It's coming, dear." I wanted to believe she was right. Each detail of the evening conspired toward a single climax. His grand gesture, the box revealed, the question asked. And yet, beneath my anticipation, there lingered something sharper. It was like catching the faint scent of smoke in a room where everyone else only smelled roses. He squeezed my hand under the table, his knuckles brushing against mine, and leaned in close to whisper that he loved me. The words landed softly, yet there was a tremor in his tone, a hesitation I couldn't quite name. It was as if the syllables were borrowed from a script, rather than rooted in his heart. I smiled anyway, because that's what I was supposed to do. Family gathered around us, plates being cleared, my aunt announcing that dessert would be served shortly, and through it all, I could feel him gearing up, like an actor behind the curtain, waiting for his cue. The stage was almost set. What I didn't know, what none of us could have predicted, was that another voice, slurred and careless, would crash into that perfect rhythm and shatter it before he ever had the chance. But in those moments, I was blind to it. I was a woman on the edge of what she thought would be a proposal, teetering between the weight of our years together and the hope of a future officially promised. And though my instincts prickled with unease, though I noticed the flicker of guilt hidden behind his polished smile, I silenced them, because the ring was there. The plan was real. The family was watching. And I believed, against my better judgment, that everything was about to change in the way I had always dreamed. As the night stretched deeper into its rhythm of laughter, clinking glasses, and the occasional eruption of overlapping conversations, I noticed more than once how his hand seemed to hover protectively over the inside pocket of his blazer, as though he were guarding something fragile, something too important to be touched by the careless bustle of the evening. It was subtle, the kind of gesture most would dismiss as nothing more than the nervous tick of a man unused to wearing formal clothes. But to me, who had watched his movements through the lens of love for years, it stood out with sharp clarity. Every time he shifted in his seat, the fabric gave away a small, almost imperceptible bulge that betrayed the presence of what I already suspected: the ring. The velvet box was hidden, yet not well enough to escape my eyes. At one point, when dessert was being arranged in the kitchen and family members bustled about, he rose to help, and for the briefest instant, the outline pressed against his jacket was illuminated by the overhead light. My breath caught, not because I was surprised, but because seeing it, tangible and undeniable, sealed the reality of what was about to unfold. There it was, the promise of a future, concealed but waiting, tucked against his chest like a secret he couldn't carry much longer. The discovery, though silent, rippled through me in ways I couldn't entirely explain. There was a swelling of warmth, a childlike excitement that wanted to believe in the magic of being chosen so publicly, to have the validation of our years together crystallized in a single moment that others would witness. But alongside that came an unease I couldn't quite silence. The ring should have felt like an anchor, proof of loyalty and permanence, and yet it stirred in me something else, a memory of every unexplained absence, every deflected question, every late-night phone call cut short with a hurried, "I'll explain later." The box was meant to symbolize trust, yet all I could think of was how trust had felt fragile lately, like glass held too tightly in the hand. Still, I forced those thoughts away and leaned into the illusion that everything was perfect. My cousins were passing slices of pie across the table. My nieces giggled with whipped cream mustaches, and my grandmother whispered again, almost conspiratorially, that she was sure tonight would be the night. I smiled, letting her believe I shared her certainty, even as my mind lingered on the box, hidden but not quite hidden, burning a hole in the air between us. He caught me looking once, and his expression shifted into something between panic and tenderness, a fleeting moment where he seemed to wonder if I had uncovered the secret he thought so carefully kept. I offered him a soft smile to ease his nerves, because in truth, I wanted him to think I was oblivious. I wanted to play the role he expected, to allow him the comfort of surprise, even as the knowledge pulsed quietly in me. There was something almost theatrical about the way he orchestrated the evening, moving in and out of conversations with my relatives, laughing a little too loudly at jokes, clinking his glass a little too often in casual cheers, all while his hand would inevitably drift back to that pocket as if rehearsing the motion he knew he would make later. The pull, the reveal, the kneel. It was strange to watch, like seeing a stage actor go through his lines backstage before stepping into the spotlight. And as I observed him, a question began to grow louder in my head. Not, when will he ask, but, why now? Why here? Why like this? Because if love was the only reason, if commitment was the heart of it, would he need the audience? Or was the family gathering not just a backdrop, but the shield he wanted, a way to box me in? So my response, whatever it might have been in private, would have to conform to the expectations of a crowd hungry for romance. When he leaned toward me during a lull, in the noise, and whispered that everything felt perfect tonight, I nodded, though part of me recoiled. Perfect wasn't the word I would have chosen. Perfect implied certainty, a seamlessness that smoothed over the jagged edges of reality. What I felt instead was a tension, a hum beneath the surface that made me hyper-aware of every detail. The way his smile faltered when he thought no one was watching, the way his cousin avoided meeting his eyes, the way he never once left his jacket unattended. My instincts whispered that the box wasn't the only thing hidden in that pocket. There were truths, buried and waiting, that might cut deeper than any diamond could shine. But I silenced those instincts. I told myself that doubt was ungrateful, that suspicion in a moment like this was self-sabotage. I let my gaze drift to the table spread, to the candles flickering in golden halos, to the faces of my family basking in the warmth of the evening. I told myself that whatever small cracks I had noticed in him lately would heal once the proposal anchored us together, that the ring would be proof not just of love, but of permanence, that his choice to propose before everyone meant he was done hiding, done with secrecy. I wanted to believe that the box carried redemption, not further deceit. And yet, as he stood to refill glasses and brushed past me, the fabric of his jacket grazing my arm, I felt the rigid outline again, sharp and undeniable. It was there, within reach, and I could have plucked it free, exposed the surprise on my own terms, forced him to reveal what he had planned before the time was ripe. But I didn't. I let it stay hidden in plain sight, a secret I pretended not to see, because part of me wanted to watch the performance unfold, to let him believe he controlled the narrative. I didn't know then that another voice, careless and intoxicated, would unravel his script long before he had the chance to kneel, that the box which seemed so heavy with promise would instead become a symbol of something hollow. For now, I let the illusion hold, smiling as though everything was aligned, while deep inside, I wondered if the ring was meant to seal a future of truth, or merely to disguise a present built on lies. The moment it happened, the room had been carried by a rhythm so steady that no one could have predicted the collapse. We were midway through dessert, spoons clinking gently against porcelain bowls, the air heavy with the scent of sugar and cinnamon, when the first wobble in the harmony appeared. My cousin, whose laughter had grown looser with every refill of his glass, stood suddenly, nearly tipping his chair as he raised a half-empty cup of wine. His face was flushed crimson, eyes glinting with the reckless brightness of someone whose tongue was no longer bound by discretion. "A toast," he slurred, his voice cutting unevenly across the chatter, pulling every gaze toward him. The table stilled. Some smiled indulgently. Others exchanged quick, wary glances, because everyone knew his habit of turning good-natured celebrations into awkward spectacles when drink took hold. I felt my chest tighten even before his words formed, as though my body understood the danger before my mind caught up. He swayed slightly, holding his glass aloft with a crooked grin. "To love," he announced, dragging the word out until it seemed almost mocking. A murmur of forced cheers echoed back, the family humoring him, but the silence that followed was thick enough to slice. And then, with the kind of careless cruelty only intoxication can unlock, he let the truth spill out. "To my dear cousin here," he said, gesturing broadly toward my boyfriend, who thinks he can juggle more than one heart at a time and still get away with it. "Cheers to that!" The words fell into the air like shards of glass, shattering the illusion of warmth that had blanketed the evening. For a split second, no one moved. The sound of forks clattering against plates echoed too loudly. Someone coughed, just to fill the silence, and I sat frozen, my spoon suspended halfway to my mouth. My ears rang as though the walls themselves had recoiled. He had spoken too clearly, too directly for it to be dismissed as drunken nonsense. The laughter that should have followed never came. Instead, the room pulsed with disbelief, the kind that makes people shift in their seats, unable to look at one another. My boyfriend's face blanched, his smile breaking like plaster cracked under pressure. He let out a weak laugh, the kind meant to sweep everything away as a joke, but it fell flat against the heavy air. My cousin wavered, clearly unaware of the grenade he had dropped, or perhaps aware but too far gone to care. "Oh, come on," he added, leaning against his chair now. "We all know about her, don't we? The late-night calls, the excuses, the mysterious errands. You think you're clever, but you're not." His words stumbled, yet the meaning was unmistakable. Eyes darted around the table, some wide with shock, others narrowing with suspicion, and I felt the sting of humiliation prickle my skin. The box in his pocket, the one I had pretended not to see, suddenly transformed from a promise into a weapon, a desperate shield he might have planned to use to bind me tighter to him before the cracks widened. He tried again to laugh it off, to wave the moment away with a dismissive flick of his hand. "He's drunk," he said too quickly, his voice pitched higher than usual, betraying the nerves he fought to hide. "He doesn't know what he's saying." But it was too late. The silence around the table wasn't the kind that believed in accidents. My father's brow furrowed. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair. My grandmother's spoon rested motionless in her bowl. The words had landed, heavy and undeniable, and no amount of brushing them aside could erase the image they conjured. Inside me, something fractured quietly. The excitement that had swelled when I glimpsed the box earlier turned sour, curdling into a sick realization that maybe my instincts hadn't been ungrateful whispers after all, but warnings I had refused to hear. My cousin's careless toast had dragged them into the open, exposed for everyone to examine. And though the room remained still, I could feel the questions multiplying in the silence. Who was she? How long had it been? How deep did the betrayal run? I searched his face for denial that felt genuine, for outrage that might clear the haze, but all I found was panic swimming behind his eyes, the desperate calculation of someone cornered by a truth he couldn't control. The cousin, satisfied with the chaos he had caused, collapsed back into his chair with a clumsy grin, sipping again, as if he hadn't detonated the night. Conversations sputtered and died, and in the gap where laughter should have been, the weight of suspicion settled thick as smoke. No one asked me if it was true. No one asked him to explain further. Instead, they stared into their plates, into their glasses, anywhere but at us. That avoidance was louder than accusation. I felt every eye that refused to meet mine, every silence that implied knowledge they hadn't shared before. I sat there, heart pounding, trapped between the image of the ring burning a hole in his pocket and the echo of my cousin's words still hanging above us like an accusation carved into stone. He shifted beside me, reaching instinctively for my hand, but I pulled away before his fingers touched mine. That small refusal, though quiet, sliced the evening into two parts, before the toast and after it. And in that moment, though no one spoke it aloud, I knew that nothing about the night could unfold as he had planned. The performance he had crafted so carefully was already unraveling, undone by the drunken honesty of a relative too careless to protect secrets that never should have existed in the first place. The silence that followed my cousin's words seemed almost alive, stretching across the dining room like a suffocating veil, thick and unyielding, pressing down on every chest and stealing the air from our lungs. For one long moment, all I could hear was the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint creak of the chandelier swaying overhead, and the pounding of my own heartbeat, each thud a reminder that the ground beneath me had shifted. My spoon slipped from my hand and clattered against the porcelain bowl, a small sound but jarring in the stillness, and it felt as though the entire table trembled with the weight of what had been unleashed. Faces around me were caught in varying stages of disbelief. My mother frozen mid-sip, her lips pursed against the rim of her glass. My aunt staring down at her untouched dessert as though she could vanish into the swirl of cream. My father's gaze locked sharply on my boyfriend with the kind of unspoken interrogation only a man who had seen too much dishonesty could deliver. No one dared speak, because to speak would mean acknowledging what had been said, and acknowledging it would mean tearing apart the fragile fabric of the evening. I looked at him, the man I had thought I knew, and saw in his face not the indignation of an innocent accused, but the terror of someone exposed. His smile, which moments before had been rehearsed and ready, faltered into a grimace. He opened his mouth once as if to protest, then closed it again, when he realized the room had already judged the authenticity of his defense before he uttered a word. The ring in his pocket, once glowing in my imagination with the promise of permanence, now seemed to burn against him like an accusation, a tiny box filled with betrayal instead of commitment. I could almost feel the heat of it radiating between us, and in my mind it transformed from a symbol of love into a shield he had planned to wield, a distraction meant to silence the whispers of doubt before they grew too loud. But my cousin's drunken revelation had pierced through it like a knife, exposing not only the fragility of his plan, but the fragility of our entire relationship. The atmosphere shifted in slow waves, unease rippling from one end of the table to the other. My younger cousins, too naive to fully grasp what had been said, giggled nervously before being hushed by their parents. My grandmother, who had always been the matriarchal anchor of our gatherings, sat rigid, her eyes narrowed not with confusion, but with recognition, as though the words had only confirmed what her intuition had whispered to her long before tonight. That look cut me deeper than any accusation could, because it implied that perhaps I had been the last to see what was plain to others, that my loyalty and my love had blinded me to the truth that had been simmering just beneath the surface. My cousin, still slouched in his chair with wine staining the edges of his lips, seemed oblivious to the wreckage he had caused. He laughed, muttering something incoherent, his words dissolving into the thick air, and I realized with a jolt that the damage was irreparable, no matter how slurred his confession had been. A drunk may exaggerate, but there is always a kernel of truth buried in the ramblings, and that truth had cracked the foundation of everything I thought I had. The others at the table shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between me and him, waiting for some kind of response, as though I held the power to dictate whether the evening continued as if nothing had happened, or descended fully into chaos. He finally spoke, his voice shaky, brittle around the edges, reaching for authority but never grasping it. He's drunk. He doesn't know what he's saying. Don't listen to him. The words hung in the air, limp and unconvincing, and no one moved to agree, no one laughed in relief. His denial fell flat, not because it was unthinkable that my cousin had spoken nonsense, but because his tone betrayed him, his desperation leaking through every syllable. A man falsely accused would have thundered his outrage, but he could only manage a thin protest, one that sounded rehearsed, flimsy, hollow. I sat perfectly still, staring at the ring-shaped bulge in his pocket, my mind playing a cruel trick as it juxtaposed the image of him kneeling before me with the image of him whispering into another woman's ear. The contrast was unbearable, and I could no longer silence the instinct that told me the toast was no drunken fiction. My cousin's words had thrown a stone into the still pond of our lives, and the ripples would not be contained. I watched the ripples spread across the faces of my family, each of them struggling to reconcile the festive evening with the ugly truth that had slipped into the open. The air grew colder, heavy with the unspoken. Dessert plates sat untouched. Candles flickered nervously, and somewhere in the kitchen, the kettle whistled shrilly as if mocking the attempt to carry on with domestic normalcy. No one dared raise their glass again. No one resumed their conversations, because the illusion had been shattered, and we all knew it. We were no longer gathered in celebration. We were sitting in the ruins of trust, staring at the man who had planned to declare himself worthy of my forever while carrying secrets that invalidated every word he might have spoken. And so we sat, the shock freezing us all in place, each of us caught in the paralysis of realization, waiting for what would come next, waiting for the truth to fully reveal itself. I could feel the eyes of the room pressing against me, silently asking what I would do, how I would respond, whether I would continue the charade or let it crumble completely. My heart, once brimming with the flutter of anticipated joy, now beat with the heavy thud of betrayal, and in that silence, I knew that the story of this night had changed forever. The proposal was no longer the climax. It had become an afterthought, swallowed whole by the shock that had frozen the room and set the stage for what was yet to unfold. It is strange how quickly the mind, once granted the smallest thread of truth, begins to tug at it until an entire tapestry collapses. In the minutes after my cousin's drunken toast, while the silence still lingered like smoke from an extinguished flame, my thoughts turned inward, connecting fragments that I had once dismissed, assembling them into a portrait too ugly to ignore. His late-night messages, always brushed aside with excuses about urgent work matters. The unexplained weekends when his phone died mysteriously for hours, leaving me staring at unread messages and missed calls. The faint traces of perfume not mine that clung to his clothes, so subtle that I had once convinced myself they were imagined. Each memory, once a solitary doubt floating in a sea of love, now linked itself into a chain, heavy and undeniable, wrapping around me with suffocating force. At the table, no one spoke, but I could feel the unvoiced judgment saturating the air. My aunt's eyes flickered toward me with pity. My father's expression hardened into something grim, My grandmother lowered her gaze as if mourning not just the loss of innocence in this evening, but the loss of what she had hoped for my future. The man sitting beside me fidgeted, shifting in his seat, his hand twitching toward his pocket as if he still believed the ring could rescue him. I could almost hear his thoughts. If he brought it out now, if he dropped to one knee, if he wrapped the room in the performance of a perfect proposal, perhaps the ugliness of the accusation would be drowned in applause. Perhaps the truth would retreat into silence. But he did not move, and his hesitation betrayed him more loudly than words ever could. I thought of the times he had pulled away from me when I asked too many questions, how quickly he had grown defensive, how easily irritation replaced tenderness when his stories didn't align. I remembered how he once snapped at me for checking his phone when it buzzed on the table, a reaction so sharp it startled me into apology, though I had only intended to silence the noise. And suddenly I realized that my apologies had been misplaced, that my attempts to preserve peace had been nothing more than the surrender of my instincts that had been screaming long before tonight that something was wrong. It was as though my cousin's careless words had cut through the fog I had wrapped around myself, and now the clarity was brutal, merciless. The unraveling was not confined to my thoughts alone. I could see it reflected in the faces of those around me. The web of lies he had spun did not only ensnare me but reached further, brushing against those who had observed him from the periphery and chosen silence over confrontation. My brother cleared his throat, shifting uneasily, and for a moment, I wondered if he too had known or suspected, if small inconsistencies had brushed against his awareness, but never been voiced out of loyalty or fear of being wrong. My mother, usually the peacemaker in tense moments, stayed silent, her lips pressed tightly together as though the weight of her own suspicions, never shared, now filled her with regret. It was clear that I had not been the only one who noticed cracks, but I had been the one who wanted most desperately to believe they would seal themselves with time. He finally broke the silence, leaning toward me with a voice that trembled, soft enough to seem intimate, but loud enough that others might overhear. "You know none of that is true," he said, the words strained, his eyes darting nervously across the table as though searching for allies. I studied his face, the way his jaw clenched, the flicker of fear behind his pupils, and for the first time in years, I realized I didn't recognize the man sitting across from me. His features were familiar, yet his expressions were those of a stranger caught in a lie, scrambling to construct a defense that even he no longer believed. And though his words reached my ears, my mind instead replayed every moment he had seemed distracted, every evening where his touch felt perfunctory, every time his gaze drifted past me as if searching for something else. The lies unraveled further when my cousin, still drunk but emboldened by the tension he had caused, chuckled and muttered, "Oh, don't act innocent now." He said it with a sloppy grin, but the damage was precise, sharp. My boyfriend's face hardened instantly, his eyes narrowing in warning toward my cousin, a look that spoke more of guilt than of outrage. And in that instant, I understood that the truth was not just whispered suspicion, but reality. And the reality was that he had betrayed me. The unraveling was complete. What struck me most was how fragile it all was, how quickly the illusion of our relationship dissolved when light was cast upon it. The years we had spent together, the plans we had made, the home we had envisioned, all of it reduced to a series of half-truths, performances, and hollow reassurances. The web had only held because I had allowed it, because I had chosen not to pull at the threads. Now that one had been tugged, the entire structure collapsed around me, and there was no salvaging it. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the evening pressing down on me, and realized that while the unraveling of lies had humiliated me in front of my family, it had also liberated me. The truth, though cruel, was better than the blindness I had lived in. I could see clearly now, even if clarity came wrapped in pain. The proposal, the ring, the performance he had planned, all of it was meaningless against the backdrop of deceit. What had begun as a night of celebration had transformed into revelation, and though my heart ached with the betrayal, there was also a spark of strength in knowing that the lies had finally lost their power. The web had unraveled, and though I was caught in the wreckage, I knew it was only the beginning of what would come next. The truth, once exposed, demands to be answered, and I could feel in my bones that the confrontation I had avoided for so long was inevitable now. He could not silence it, not with a ring, not with rehearsed words, not with promises of a future already poisoned. The unraveling had begun, and nothing could stop it from tearing the rest of his facade apart. The weight of silence after the unraveling was unbearable, the kind of silence that hums in your ears and makes your skin prickle, because everyone knows that something has broken and cannot be mended by pretending it hasn't. My cousin slumped further into his chair, muttering incoherent fragments that no one dared address, while my family clung to their plates and glasses as though eating and drinking could disguise the truth hanging in the air. And yet, at the center of it all, he sat beside me with his jaw clenched, his hand twitching toward the ring in his pocket, as if he still believed he could salvage the night by forcing his performance to unfold. But it was too late. I felt it in the stiffness of my body, in the heaviness of my chest. A proposal made now would be nothing but a bandage over a festering wound, and I could not let him control the script any longer. The confrontation rose in me before I had decided to give it voice, a tide I could no longer hold back. My throat burned as I finally turned to him, my words low enough that only those closest could hear, yet sharp enough to slice through the fragile pretense. Who is she? The question escaped not as a scream, not with the desperation of a woman clinging to hope, but with the cold precision of someone who already knows the answer and simply demands confirmation. His face flickered with panic, his mouth opening in denial, but the hesitation before he spoke betrayed him more thoroughly than any words could. "There's no one," he stammered, but his eyes betrayed him, darting too quickly, avoiding mine, searching for an escape in the faces of those who surrounded us. The family, once pretending to be distracted, leaned in with unspoken attention. I could feel their gazes pressing on us, a silent jury awaiting testimony, and the more he squirmed under that invisible weight, the clearer it became that the truth was not on his side. I remembered the countless evenings when he had brushed off my questions, the times he had dismissed my suspicions as paranoia, the sharp tone he had used to silence me whenever I pressed too close. Now, in this moment, all of those evasions came back to me, each one a fragment of a confession he had never voiced, and I realized with startling clarity that I had always known this confrontation would come. It had simply been delayed, postponed by my willingness to believe in the illusion he spun for us both. My father finally broke the collective silence, his voice steady, but filled with the stern edge that once guided me as a child. "If it isn't true," he said, eyes fixed on the man beside me, "then say it clearly. Here, now. Look her in the eyes and say it." The words struck like a gavel, and the room shifted, leaning further into the inevitable. He hesitated again, and in that pause I felt the final fracture, the collapse of everything I had convinced myself to hold on to. He swallowed hard, his lips parting, but what came out was not conviction, not the thunderous denial of innocence, but a weak repetition of the same refrain. "He's drunk. He doesn't know what he's talking about." And yet the tremor in his voice undid him. The denial did not land. It floated, hollow, dissipating into nothing. I looked at him, my voice sharper now, refusing to let him retreat into vagueness. "Then why are you trembling? Why can't you look at me?" The words rang louder than I intended, and a hush spread again. The family caught in the spectacle, no longer pretending to be uninvolved. His hand once again brushed the outline of the box in his pocket, and I understood in that moment that he thought of it not as a gift, but as a weapon, a distraction to turn the tide in his favor. I almost pitied him then, for believing that a ring could rewrite betrayal, that the glitter of diamonds could blind me to the truth already exposed. But pity quickly dissolved into fury, and the fury into something steadier, colder. He tried to speak, stumbling over fragments of explanations, work trips, misunderstandings, exaggerated rumors, but every word tangled in the net of his own contradictions. Each denial only highlighted the absence of certainty, each attempt at justification exposing how flimsy his stories were. My cousin's drunken toast had been the spark, but now his own faltering words poured gasoline over the fire, and I watched as the structure of his lies collapsed under the weight of their own weakness. At some point I realized my family was no longer eating, no longer shifting uncomfortably. They were watching openly now, their silence not out of discomfort but out of allegiance to me, waiting to see if I would crumble or stand. That realization steadied me, I turned back to him, my voice quiet but cutting. You wanted to propose tonight, didn't you? You wanted to make me say yes in front of everyone, so I couldn't say no. Was that your plan? To cover everything up with a ring? His eyes widened, the flush on his cheeks deepening, and his silence in that moment was answer enough. The confrontation had broken free of restraint. I was no longer protecting him, no longer protecting myself from the humiliation of acknowledging the betrayal. The words flowed now, steady and unrelenting, carrying with them years of silent suspicion. I should have known, I continued, my tone colder than I had ever heard in my own voice. The late nights, the excuses, the way you flinched when I came too close to the truth. I gave you chances. I gave you trust, and you turned it into a performance. But the curtain's down now. Everyone can see it. His lips quivered, his hand still pressed to the box, but he did not draw it out. He must have realized that even if he placed it in my hand now, even if he dropped to his knees, the diamond would be nothing more than glass to me, a glittering lie too fragile to hold. I rose from my chair slowly, my body trembling not with fear, but with the release of tension that had been building for too long. The confrontation was no longer private. It belonged to the room, to the witnesses who would carry the memory of this night long after it ended. And though my heart ached, though my chest tightened with the weight of betrayal, I felt a strange clarity as I stood there. His lies had unraveled, his defenses crumbled, and there was nothing left between us but truth, raw and unbearable. The confrontation could no longer be delayed, and in that moment, I knew it was only the beginning of the reckoning yet to come. I will never forget the expression on his face when, despite the room pressing in around him, despite the confrontation unraveling the last of his lies, he still believed he could salvage everything with the gesture he had rehearsed. His hand slipped once more into his pocket, fumbling, almost desperate, and when he withdrew it, the velvet box sat in his palm like a black stone, heavy and hollow. He rose from his chair, his legs stiff, his shoulders squared as if sheer posture could restore authority, and he turned toward me with a look that was supposed to be confident, but was betrayed by the tremor of his jaw and the panic flickering in his eyes. The room, already fractured by the revelation, shifted again into silence, every eye now locked on him, waiting for the spectacle that was unfolding in grotesque distortion of what should have been a tender, private moment. He lowered himself clumsily to one knee, the chair behind him scraping harshly against the floor, a noise that made the moment feel even more jagged, more wrong. The box clicked open, and the diamond caught the light of the chandelier, throwing fragments of brilliance across the table. But instead of inspiring awe, the sparkle felt cruel, like shards of broken glass scattering over the remains of a meal that no one had finished. He looked up at me, forcing a smile that cracked under its own strain, and said the words he must have repeated to himself in front of the mirror, words rehearsed and polished, but now stripped of all their meaning. I love you. Will you marry me? It should have been the culmination of years, the promise of forever, but in that moment, it felt like an insult, an attempt to bind me tighter to the very betrayal that had just been exposed. My family stared in stunned silence, some with pity etched into their features, others with outrage simmering beneath their restraint. My father's jaw clenched. My mother's hand gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened, and my grandmother shook her head faintly, as though she couldn't bear to witness the mockery of tradition unfolding before her. I stood frozen, not from indecision, but from the sheer absurdity of what he had done. The confrontation moments before had already stripped him bare, revealed him for what he was, and yet here he was kneeling in a room thick with betrayal, believing that the glitter of a ring could blind us all to the truth that had already poisoned the air. His voice cracked when he repeated himself, this time quieter, almost pleading. Please, marry me. The word please rang through me like a hollow bell, not filled with love but with desperation, not a request for my hand but a grasp at control. He was not asking me to share a future. He was begging me to shield him from the shame now closing in on him from every direction. I looked at the ring, gleaming and lifeless, and felt no pull toward it, no swell of affection, only the sharp sting of insult. How could he imagine that I would say yes now, after all that had been revealed? How could he believe that love could survive the wreckage of lies, that the word forever could still be spoken between us when the present itself had been shattered? I could hear whispers at the edges of the table, cousins murmuring, my aunt gasping softly, the shifting of chairs as people adjusted themselves for the moment they knew was coming. The silence was no longer neutral. It was charged with anticipation. The family waiting to see if I would bend, if I would betray myself for the sake of performance. And in that tension, I realized the cruelty of his timing. He had chosen this gathering for his proposal not because it was romantic, but because it was strategic. Surrounded by witnesses, he believed I would be forced to accept, forced to smile, forced to let him slip the ring onto my finger while burying the doubts he had known were growing inside me. But the plan had collapsed the moment my cousin spoke, and now his gesture was not grand but pathetic, not romantic, but desperate. I did not reach for the ring. I did not cry or gasp or cover my mouth in surprise. I let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, until his arm holding the box began to tremble with the weight of it, until his knees pressed awkwardly against the floorboards, and the strain of his performance began to show in his reddened face. Finally, I spoke, my voice calm, steady, carrying through the room with the clarity of finality. No. The word was simple, but it sliced through the air with the force of a verdict. His face crumpled, his mouth opening as if to protest, but the word had already sunk in, echoed in the stillness, solid and irreversible. I stood, pushing back my chair slowly, and looked down at him, not with love, not even with hatred, but with the kind of detached pity one feels for a man who still clings to the illusion of control when it has already slipped away. You don't get to propose to me as a distraction, I said softly, though the entire room heard. You don't get to cover lies with diamonds. My voice did not shake, though my hands trembled at my sides, and I realized then that the strength I felt came not from anger but from release. The spell was broken, the illusion gone, and there was nothing left between us but truth. He stayed kneeling, the box still open, his eyes wide and pleading, but the ring no longer held any power over me. The proposal had turned to ashes in his hands, its meaning burned away by betrayal, leaving only the empty shell of a gesture that had once promised joy, but now delivered only humiliation. I turned away, the murmurs of my family swelling behind me, and in that moment, I understood that this night, which he had intended as the beginning of our forever, would instead be remembered as the night I refused to bind myself to a lie. The word no still echoed in the air when I turned from him, its resonance hanging heavier than any scream could have. I had expected silence, perhaps even relief, but what followed was far more complicated, a collision of voices, shifting allegiances, and emotions too tangled to be contained within the fragile walls of my parents' dining room. My refusal, though spoken with clarity, cracked the evening wide open, and in the wake of my decision, my family erupted into a storm of divided reactions, some sharp with anger, others laced with pity, and still others cloaked in awkward attempts at neutrality. My mother was the first to move, her chair scraping against the wooden floor as she stood, her hands clutching at the backrest as though she needed it to steady herself. Her eyes, wide and glistening, darted between me and him, and I could see the torn fabric of her instincts. She had always been the one to mend, to smooth edges, to fill silences with apologies that weren't hers to give, and now she searched for words that could glue the evening back together. "Maybe we should all just calm down," she murmured, her voice trembling, as if moderation could somehow erase the betrayal that had unfolded before us. But her plea was swallowed by the tension, her attempt at peace too fragile to survive the weight of what had already been revealed. My father, in contrast, remained seated, his back straight, his jaw clenched. He said nothing at first, but the silence around him was commanding, more powerful than the clamor rising elsewhere. When his gaze finally lifted and locked on the man still kneeling with the ring clutched in his trembling hand, it was filled not with rage, but with the cold condemnation of someone who had already judged and found the accused guilty. He didn't need to raise his voice. His disapproval filled the room like smoke, seeping into every corner, undeniable and suffocating. Across the table, my aunt shifted uncomfortably, her hands fluttering to her chest, as though shielding herself from the ugliness of what she had just witnessed. "Maybe it's just a misunderstanding," she said quickly, her tone desperate, her eyes pleading with me to reconsider, as though the shame of a broken proposal was worse than the pain of enduring deceit. Everyone makes mistakes. A marriage can survive this. Her words stung, not because I considered them true, but because they revealed how easily some would rather plaster over betrayal than face the discomfort of truth. She wanted the story to end neatly, for me to smile and accept the ring so the evening could resume its course, but her comfort would have come at the cost of my dignity, and I refused to surrender it. My cousin, the one whose drunken toast had detonated the evening, chuckled softly, oblivious to the devastation he had caused, or perhaps proud of it. "Told you all," he muttered, sinking lower into his seat, his grin loose and foolish. His words earned him sharp looks from nearly everyone, but none sharper than from my boyfriend, whose face burned with a fury that had nothing to do with love lost and everything to do with his humiliation being made public. Their eyes locked for a fraction of a second, and I realized that if my cousin had been sober enough, he might have provided even more detail, might have unraveled every hidden corner of the affair. The possibility hung unspoken in the air, another fracture waiting to widen. Some of the younger cousins giggled nervously, too young to grasp the gravity of what had transpired, whispering behind their hands as though it were all some theatrical drama staged for their entertainment. My grandmother, however, silenced them with a single stern glance. She had not moved since I had spoken my refusal, her frail hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes trained on me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. There was sorrow there, yes, but also pride, the quiet recognition of strength. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but carried across the table with authority born of decades. "She has given her answer. That is enough." The room stilled momentarily at her words, as though the matriarch had set a boundary no one dared cross. But not everyone accepted it so easily. One of my uncles leaned forward, his brow furrowed, his tone critical as he addressed me directly. "Are you sure you want to humiliate him like this, in front of everyone?" His words sliced deeper than I expected, not because they questioned my choice, but because they revealed how easily the focus shifted from his betrayal to my response. The implication was clear, that I should have swallowed the truth, played the role of dutiful partner, spared the man kneeling before me from disgrace. I stared at him, feeling the heat rise in my chest, but I did not answer, because I knew no explanation would change his perspective. To him, keeping the peace mattered more than keeping integrity, and I refused to live by that creed. Through it all, he remained kneeling, his face a mask of desperation, his arm shaking under the weight of the ring he still held aloft. His eyes darted from face to face, seeking someone, anyone, to rescue him from the judgment pressing in, but all he found were fractured allegiances, half-hearted defenses, and silent condemnation. The diamond sparkled uselessly in the candlelight, a cruel reminder of how quickly meaning can turn to mockery. I felt the room dividing around me. Those who pitied me, those who pitied him, those who longed for silence, and those who secretly reveled in the drama. And yet, amid the noise, I felt a clarity that steadied me. This was not about them, not about their discomfort or their expectations. It was about me reclaiming what had been stolen quietly over months of lies and deceit. Their reactions, though loud and varied, no longer mattered. The only voice that carried weight was mine, and I had already spoken the word that ended it. Still, the chaos left its mark. I knew the family would carry this night into whispers, into gossip over phone calls and gatherings yet to come, dissecting every detail, debating whether I had been too harsh or not harsh enough. But I also knew that whatever story they told, it would not be one of my weakness. It would be the story of the night he tried to propose, and I turned him down, and the ring turned to ash. Their divided reactions were just noise around that unshakable truth. And as I stood there, surrounded by voices tugging in every direction, I realized that I was no longer listening to them. I was listening only to myself, and the silence I carried within was louder, clearer, stronger than all the clamor that filled the room. There comes a moment in every story when the noise fades, when the voices of others recede into a dull background hum, and only the truth remains, standing unshakable in the center of the room. That moment came to me as I stood there, the clamor of my family splitting into threads of argument and pity, the ring still glinting uselessly in his trembling hand, and the look of desperation carved into his face. For the first time all night, I no longer felt the need to explain myself or justify my refusal. The decision had already crystallized within me, clear and irrevocable, and it was not for them, not for him, but for me. My dignity, my peace, my future demanded it. I drew in a long breath, and with it, the chaos seemed to settle into stillness. My mother's half-formed pleas, my aunt's desperate suggestions of forgiveness, my uncle's criticisms of my supposed cruelty, all of it lost its grip on me. Even the drunken mutters of my cousin, who had unknowingly detonated the truth at the center of the evening, faded into insignificance. I looked at the man who had once been the person I trusted above all, and I saw not a lover, not a partner, not even a friend. I saw a stranger wrapped in layers of deception, kneeling at my feet not in devotion but in fear, not in love but in panic. The ring he offered was not a promise, but a trap. One last desperate attempt to bind me to him, to make me complicit in his performance, to keep me tethered to a life built on lies. I stepped back from him slowly, deliberately, putting space between us that felt both symbolic and necessary. "Stand up," I said quietly, my voice steady though my chest burned with the weight of so many unshed tears. "This is over." The words landed with finality, cutting through the lingering noise in the room, and for the first time, the silence that followed was not suffocating but liberating. He looked up at me with wide eyes, his lips parting as if to beg, to argue, to plead for another chance. But I shook my head before he could speak. "No more lies, no more performances. We're done." He rose shakily to his feet, the box still open in his hand, and for a fleeting moment, I thought he might try to force the ring into mine, to press it against me, as though the symbol alone could undo what had been exposed. But the weight of the room held him back, the eyes of my father boring into him, the quiet authority of my grandmother's gaze, the whispered gasps of cousins and aunts who would carry this story long after tonight. He faltered, his arm lowering, the box finally snapping shut with a hollow click that sounded more like a coffin lid than the beginning of a love story. I turned then, not toward him, not toward the fragments of what we had been, but toward the door. My feet felt heavy at first, each step dragging against the gravity of all that had been invested in him. The years, the sacrifices, the dreams whispered late at night when I thought I was speaking to a man who loved me honestly. But as I moved, that heaviness gave way to lightness, as though I were peeling layers of deceit from my skin with every step. The murmurs rose again behind me, some in approval, some in dismay, but none of them mattered anymore. What mattered was that I was choosing myself, my dignity, my truth. As I reached the door, I paused for just a moment, my hand resting on the frame. I turned back briefly, not to linger on him, not to second-guess my choice, but to leave him with the image that would stay with him long after the sting of humiliation faded. I stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes dry and unyielding. "You had a chance to be honest," I said, my voice calm, almost detached. "You chose lies instead, and now you live with them." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. The silence I left behind was my answer, more powerful than any argument or plea he could have given. Outside the dining room, the air felt cooler, fresher, as though the house itself had been suffocating me, and now released me into the night. I walked through the familiar hallways with a strange sense of detachment, aware that the echoes of my footsteps would linger in that house long after I was gone, carrying with them the memory of the night I chose dignity over deceit. When I stepped out into the crisp evening air, I felt the weight of 1,000 eyes lift from my shoulders. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt free. The night was not quiet. I could still hear muffled voices from inside, the fallout of my decision spreading through the family like ripples in a pond. There would be arguments, there would be gossip, there would be judgment passed in hushed tones for weeks, months, maybe longer, but none of it mattered. I had walked away, not in shame, not in defeat, but in strength. The lies had unraveled, the proposal had turned to ashes, and now, by my own choice, I had left with my dignity intact, I did not know then what the next days would hold, how he would try to reach me, how others might attempt to sway me with excuses or pleas for reconciliation. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would not return. I would not step back into the web I had just torn myself free from. My decision was final, my path already set. And as I walked into the darkness of the night, I felt not fear but resolve, knowing that the worst had already been endured, and the rest of my life was mine to reclaim. In the weeks that followed, the night of the gathering replayed in my mind with the clarity of a film I could not stop watching. Though each time I remembered it, the sting lessened and the meaning grew. At first, I felt the humiliation like a brand seared into my skin, the whispers of my family echoing louder in my head than they had in the dining room. But as the days stretched into weeks, I began to realize that what had felt like an ending was truly the beginning of something far greater. My life no longer revolved around the half-truths and careful performances of a man who had built his affection on sand. Instead, it began to expand in directions I had long neglected, pieces of myself unfolding like petals that had been forced shut by the weight of deceit. He tried to contact me, of course. There were messages at first, long, rambling apologies typed at odd hours, filled with excuses and confessions that danced around the truth but never fully faced it. He blamed stress, loneliness, misunderstandings, even my cousin's drunken exaggerations, each attempt at justification laced with the same weakness I had seen in his eyes when he knelt before me. I did not reply. Then came the calls, some pleading, some angry, his voice shifting between regret and rage as though he believed that if one tone failed, another might succeed. I did not answer. He sent flowers once, left outside my door in a desperate gesture, their fragrance filling the hallway for days. But to me they smelled only of manipulation, not of love. I left them to wilt, their petals curling and drying into dust, a fitting symbol of what we had been. What surprised me most was not his persistence, but the freedom I felt in refusing it. Each ignored message, each unanswered call, each unopened envelope gave me strength, reminded me that I no longer belonged to him, no longer needed to bend myself into silence to preserve a relationship already rotten at its core. I had walked away, and with every step I took beyond that door, I was building a life that was mine alone. For the first time in years, I could breathe without wondering what secrets hid behind someone else's words. The family, too, carried the night in their own ways. There were whispers, of course, conversations I was not meant to hear, but inevitably reached me. Some called me brave, others harsh. Some pitied me, others admired me. But in the end, even their divided opinions faded, because the truth had been undeniable, and no amount of speculation could change the fact that I had chosen dignity over deceit. My grandmother's words lingered most in my memory. She has given her answer. That is enough. That sentence became a mantra, a shield against the lingering doubts that occasionally rose in the quiet hours of night. I had given my answer, and it was enough, because it was mine. Slowly, I began to rediscover pieces of myself I had set aside during the years I spent trying to hold us together. I took long walks in the evenings, letting the cool air remind me that solitude was not loneliness, but liberation. I picked up books I had abandoned, stories that reignited my imagination in ways his constant distractions had once smothered. I reconnected with friends I had distanced myself from, ashamed of how often I had excused his absences and silences. And to my surprise, they welcomed me back with open arms, their laughter stitching new warmth into the fabric of my days. Each small act of living for myself, each step taken without his shadow trailing behind me, became a declaration of resilience. There were nights when the ache still rose, unbidden, when I lay in bed and felt the emptiness beside me like a wound. But even in those moments, I knew the ache was not for him, not for the man who betrayed me, but for the dream I had once built with him, the vision of a future that would never exist. Grieving that dream was painful, but it was also cleansing. By letting it die, I made room for something better, something rooted not in illusion but in truth. The night of the proposal that wasn't became a story told and retold in my family, each retelling softened with time, until it was no longer the tragedy it had felt like in the moment, but a turning point. a tale of courage and clarity. And I began to see it that way too. What had once been ashes was now the fertile ground from which I grew stronger, more certain, more myself. He had thought he could trap me with a ring, that he could silence doubt with diamonds, but instead, he had given me the gift of clarity. By showing me who he truly was, he had freed me from the lie I had almost tethered my life to. One evening, months after that night, I found the courage to slip the dress I had worn to the gathering into a donation bag. It no longer held the weight of humiliation. It was just fabric now, ready to be worn by someone else, in a different story, unburdened by betrayal. As I folded it neatly and placed it inside, I felt a sense of closure settle over me. That chapter was done, sealed, and I had emerged not as a victim, but as the author of my own ending. Stronger without him. That was the truth I carried forward. Not bitter, not broken, but stronger. I had learned that love without honesty is nothing more than performance, that promises mean little when built on lies, and that dignity is worth more than any diamond. And so I walked forward into the life ahead of me, no longer haunted by the night he knelt with a ring in his hand, but empowered by the night I stood tall and said no.